Did you know that your brain constantly seeks to balance pleasure and suffering? And how it affects your life? Let's embark on a journey to learn how our brains manage pleasure and suffering. I believe one of the most important findings in neuroscience in the last 70 years is the coexistence of pleasure and suffering in the brain. The same part of the brain that processes pleasure also processes suffering, working in a delicate balance. The fundamental rule of this balance is that the brain constantly strives to maintain it. When the balance tilts towards pleasure, the brain seeks to return to a neutral state. This is known as homeostasis. To maintain this balance, the brain creates equal amounts of opposing stimuli when one side is stimulated. For example, when I'm enjoying watching a program on YouTube, the balance leans towards pleasure. But once the program ends, the brain generates an equal amount of suffering to restore the balance, leading to a psychological dip and making me want to watch another YouTube video. Often, we are not aware of the suffering that arises to balance pleasure unless we pay close attention. It doesn't occur at a conscious level unless we start to consciously acknowledge it. For instance, when you're on social media and come across a tweet that you really enjoy, you find it difficult to stop using social media because you know that leaving would result in a certain amount of suffering. This suffering is not physical pain but rather a psychological drop, a sense of something missing or a desire for more. One way to combat this suffering is to engage in more and more of what brings pleasure. I want you to be aware of this. When you visualize the balance of pleasure and suffering in your mind, you can understand what it means at the level of your nervous system. This awareness allows you to gain control over this process. What we need to do is keep this process under control. Eventually, we need to detach ourselves from the source of pleasure. We cannot remain constantly attached to a source of pleasure because there are other things we need to do. However, continuously seeking pleasure and avoiding suffering in this way can have serious consequences. The addictive nature of behaviors or substances primarily stems from their ability to trigger excessive dopamine release in our reward system. For example, eating broccoli, when you are not hungry, doesn't trigger a significant dopamine release, but a chocolate cake does. When dopamine levels peak, your brain reduces the number of dopamine receptors to restore balance. During this time, we may feel a sense of unease, an urge for more than what the pleasurable stimulus provides. If we can manage to wait it out, this feeling will pass as our dopamine levels return to average. However, if we don't wait and constantly indulge in the pleasurable stimulus, we eventually weigh down the balance with so much suffering that our brain establishes a new equilibrium, leaning towards the inability to experience pleasure. This state is known as dopamine depletion. By doing so, you allow suffering to become the primary controller of your life. If you constantly dive into the source of pleasure or behavior, even without consuming or engaging in it, you will constantly find yourself in a dopamine-depleted state, akin to clinical depression. Anxiety, restlessness, insomnia, and thoughts of quickly accessing that pleasure become overwhelming. While it may be easy to balance single instances of pleasure sources, chronic use disrupts the re-establishment of the dopamine balance. Consequently, nothing brings pleasure anymore, except for that specific drug or activity. Don't forget to incorporate these insights into your life and stay tuned to Tech News for more valuable content.